Hello, everyone. This is Eric Tars. I'm the Legal Director at the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty, and I'm excited to welcome you to Housing Not Handcuffs, Hope for Change at the Federal Level. This is one in our series of COVID webinars that we are having every other week, and trying to keep people up to date on what is going on in the world of housing and homelessness all across the country, on the legal side, on the policy side, and what we need to do to make sure that the people we care about in our communities are going to be safe and healthy through the crisis and beyond. Today we have an all-star panel of experts who are working from the federal to the local level to create housing and to fight the criminalization of homelessness. Today, following some brief orientation, we will hopefully hear from Representative Pramila Jayapal, who is working on some technical issues at the moment, about her groundbreaking Housing is a Human Right Act, the first federal legislation to talk about housing as a human right, and to directly incentivize communities to stop criminalizing homelessness. If we aren't able to hear from her first, we will hear from Anna Oliva, the current Center for Budget and Policy Priorities Senior Fellow and former HUD Deputy Assistant Secretary, about other federal bills dealing with housing and homelessness during the COVID crisis. And then Kathy Alderman from the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless will talk about how current federal programs are helping or aren't helping in Colorado and what more needs to be done from the provider perspective. Then Francine Friedman and Christina Barone, our pro bono counsel from Aiden Gump, will get us up to date on what's happening with the efforts to defund the police and invest in housing and resources instead at the federal level. And then we'll have some time for questions and answers. So, although participants can't speak during the webinar, you'll see on your sidebar a comment box in which you can type your questions and which will be read at the end of the presentation. We will also try to be answering them by text form during the presentation. So you can just type them in as the webinar goes along and just enter them into the question box. There's a question box and a chat box. Enter it into the question box is the easiest way to get it to us. Also, please do note that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted later. So if you have any concerns about identifying yourself, please be aware of that, but also know that you will be able to view the webinar again and share it. And if you registered and are on the webinar now, we will get you the link to the webinar when it does go up. We'll be able to share the slides and any resources that are mentioned during the webinar. We'll get those all to you in an email afterwards. And last but not least, while I don't encourage multitasking, if you just have itchy Twitter fingers and you need to share some of the brilliant points that are soon to be made by our presenters, please do tag us at NLCHP Homeless or use the hashtag Housing Not Handcuffs in your post so we can amplify the conversation further. And before we jump into the presenters, I do want to mention that the title of this webinar comes from our Housing Not Handcuffs campaign, which we launched in 2016 together with the National Coalition for the Homeless and more than 100 national and local organizations, and now has thousands of endorsers from public officials to people experiencing homelessness. As the name suggests, Housing Not Handcuffs was talking about defunding the police and investing in housing and services instead, before it became a national hashtag last month. And we have a wealth of resources from talking points to sample legislation on our website to help seed the current conversations about how do we actually do that work of defunding the police and what does the alternative look like. So if you haven't already, please do endorse the campaign at housingnothandcuffs.org and share the resources with others in your community. So with that, Do we have Representative Jayapal on the line yet? Testing 1, testing 2, does not look like it. So we will go straight through to Anna Leva, who, as I said, is currently Senior Fellow at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and was formerly the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Special Needs at HUD. Anne was our internal ally pushing criminalization policy at HUD through the 20-teens and helped us to get the current funding incentive against criminalization in the Continuum of Care application. She's always been a champion for people experiencing homelessness, and she's currently helping lead the coordinating efforts amongst a group of national housing and homelessness organizations that kind of pulled together in the wake of new threats from the Trump administration to criminalize homelessness and lock people up in internment camps, and has instead been now pushing an affirmative agenda for housing and not for handcuffs. So we are excited to have Anne here with us, and I will let her take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Eric. It's a pleasure to be here talking to folks this afternoon about what I think are a really important set of topics. And we're going to start this presentation today talking a little bit about the current federal response to COVID-19 for people who are experiencing homelessness. So I'm going to run through what we have in place now, what we think is coming down the pike in terms of new resources and budget for 2021, and just raise a couple of other quick items for folks to be aware of before I turn it back over to you. I wanted to start this conversation by saying, I was at HUD running the programs that were funded by the Recovery Act in 2009. Up until the CARES Act passed, the Homelessness Prevention and Rapid Rehousing Program, HPRP, that many of you will probably remember, was the largest homelessness prevention and rapid rehousing program in US history at the time that it was funded. And we had never done anything like that before, certainly not at that scale. So whenever I talk about this new CARES Act funding, what I start with is really asking communities to do a few things as they're planning for how to use these dollars. The first is learn from our mistakes in HPRP. I am always the first one to admit that I know that I made some mistakes in the implementation of HPRP. I think that communities learned a lot by implementing that program and the Continuum of Care and ESG program since then. But this is an unprecedented opportunity. Even just the $4 billion of emergency solutions grants COVID money that was provided under the CARES Act that I'm just about to talk about, just for scale purposes for folks who don't know, ESG in a normal year is $290 million. ESG in this form is $4 billion. So we have an opportunity here, not just to learn from what we've done in the past, what's worked and what's not worked, but we have responsibility, even more than an opportunity, for using this funding to make foundational change in our systems, especially using these funds to implement a racial justice and equity approach within the homeless services system and in how we connect to other systems, other mainstream systems. So I think it's both an opportunity, but I also see it as a responsibility for implementers across the country. So let's talk a little bit about some of the funding that is that has already been passed by Congress. and some other resources. So first, I'll note that most people know that there is currently an eviction moratorium in place. So there's 120-day eviction protection right now for people who are living in assisted housing and federally backed properties. There's a variety of rules around what can and can't happen during the moratorium period, but that is about to expire. I believe it expires at the end of this month. So what happens next is going to be incredibly important as we think about how folks might be impacted by the economic downturn and the potential pulling back of eviction moratoria while they still cannot get access to employment. So we'll talk about that as we go through this presentation. The CARES Act itself included a number of resources that can be used to assist people who are experiencing homelessness or who are at risk of homelessness. So I'll first mention the $150 billion coronavirus relief fund that went to states, and that does include homelessness as an eligible activity. $5 billion for the Community Development Block Grant Program, which is usually the funding that we get into the system when there is a natural disaster. So that is something that a lot of communities are used to using in a disaster situation. As I mentioned earlier, $4 billion in the Emergency Solutions Grants Program, specifically to support people who are experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness during COVID-19. And then there's a variety of other housing-related tenant income protections that are included in the CARES Act that address things through the housing voucher, Housing Choice Voucher Program, public housing, project-based rental assistance, housing for seniors, housing for people with disabilities, Native American programs, and housing opportunities for persons with AIDS. So that's sort of the very high level overview of what is included in the CARES Act for housing. But I would also really encourage communities to look at the CARES Act as a whole, because there are other resources, income supports, behavioral health resources, LIHEAP, childcare resources that can be used as part of a package of tools for a community to have the most comprehensive response to COVID-19, especially for people who are experiencing homelessness and housing instability. So I would encourage folks not just to look at the housing piece of this, but to really look at all of the funding that comes through the CARES Act. And there is a link to the CARES Act itself at the bottom of the page. Go to the next slide.
Actually, Anne,
sure.
Do you mind if we
nope,
switch back? All right, great. So we will get to the what comes next part of Anne's presentation in a minute, but in the meantime, we are excited to get back to Representative Pramila Jayapal, who I am personally thrilled to have here joining us today. I came to the Law Center 14 years ago, hired on as our human rights staff attorney with the explicit mission to bring the human rights framework to bear on our advocacy. And back then, I was often met with questions and hesitation even from other advocates talking about how impractical it was, how this is just pie in the sky talk. Why are we talking about human rights when we have so little here in the U.S.? But we stuck it out, and the day that I got called by Ellie Kugler, Representative Jayapal's counsel, to help work on language for the Housing is a Human Right Act, was the day that I really felt we had reached a tipping point, that we had federal legislation that talks about housing not just as an aspirational goal, not as a market commodity, but as a human right. And I know this is an intro for Representative Jayapal, but I have to mention Ellie, who just gets credited to Representative Jayapal for hiring such a great counsel, but this is a former Skid Row attorney who gets the issues of homelessness that we are talking about. So if you all are looking for a friend on Capitol Hill, just give Ellie a call and she will make it happen. And I could say the same about Representative Jayapal herself. Coming to the U.S. as an immigrant, she learned about economics and finance, but then transitioned those skills on behalf of the poorest and most marginalized in her community, doing everything from tutoring in Chicago's Cabrini Green public housing developments, working as a community banker, and doing global development work before launching into her domestic policy career with her efforts to make Washington State a hate-free zone in the wake of 9/11. And yes, as you can hear, I am about 3 chapters deep into Representative Jayapal's brand new book, Use the Power You Have, available now at your local bookstore. But it's a great read. And now, since coming to Congress representing the 7th District in 2017, Representative Jayapal has worked with the Progressive Caucus to launch a number of bills, but for today's purposes, we are highlighting her Housing as a Human Right Act, which is part of a broader package of bills called the People's Housing Platform, developed by and for people with lived experience of homelessness and housing insecurity. And each of those bills deals with an aspect of the human right to housing, but Representative Jayapal's bill focuses on people currently experiencing homelessness. I will let her explain the details, but for me, one of the most important points is obviously that in addition to funding housing and other policy reforms, it's one of the first bills that is specifically tying funding to preventing criminalization of homelessness in the community. And this is exactly the connection we have been making through the Housing Not Handcuffs campaign. And it's amazing to see it in federal legislation. It's always been important, but obviously with the current movement for divesting from law enforcement and investing instead into housing and social services, it is clear that the time for this exact bill is right now. So I will stop talking and turn over to Representative Jayapal to say more about how she is fighting to make housing a human right. Oh, we can't hear you. Uh-oh.
Okay, how about now?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, great. Sorry for all the technical difficulties. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Eric. And you know, I know it's hard sometimes when you're calling for things before the rest of the world recognizes that that's what you are calling for and that's what's right. But I just want to say, I think, you know, I have a career in doing that, and I can tell you that your work matters so much. And it just takes a while sometimes for people to catch up to the most just and best idea. And in the book, I talk about how being a progressive really means that. It just means that you're first to the best and most just idea. So thank you so much for your advocacy on this important issue and for the framework, because the framework and the narrative really matters. And I want to apologize to Anne for getting in the middle of her presentation, her excellent presentation. And thank you, Anne, for your work as well and for letting me jump in here before you finish up. So I am just delighted to be on this call today. And Eric, you were absolutely right to give credit and a shout out to Ellie Kugler, who has done a phenomenal job and brings her own lived experience as a lawyer on Skid Row to this work and to my office. So very grateful to Ellie. The National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty is doing such important work, and being able to be with you as dedicated advocates and stakeholders on this call who understand that housing is a human right is absolutely essential to our movement and our organizing and our ability to actually move policy change forward. So let me tell you a little bit about the Housing as a Human Right bill and also about the People's Housing Platform, and also just share a little bit more about my values. Now, many of you may already be supporters of the Housing as a Human Right bill, and I'm so proud that we have 55 national and local organizations that have expressed their official support for the bill. And I thank the coalition for letting so many advocates know that this bill is here and that we desperately need your advocacy and your support to continue to move it forward. Even before COVID, people in the United States faced a dual crisis of homelessness and housing instability. Rates of unsheltered homelessness have just increased, including a sharp uptick in school children sleeping in places that are simply not meant for human habitation. 1 in 4 renters was spending half of their monthly income on rent, and almost 1 million tenants are evicted each year. A parent earning the minimum wage cannot afford safe and healthy housing for their family anywhere in the United States. And again, this is pre-COVID. The numbers look much, much worse now. And so as a result, many members of our communities do not have adequate, safe places to live. Not having housing makes it extremely difficult to seek or hold a job, obtain regular care for ongoing health conditions, obtain assistance with accessing resources, or finding another place to live. And further, the harsh conditions of unsheltered homelessness leads to a mortality rate that is 4 to 9 times higher than that of the general public. And so for these reasons, the United Nations has recognized that housing is a human right. And homelessness follows our existing patterns of inequality in the United States. Communities of color, transgender and gender nonconforming people, and LGBTQ folks, people with disabilities, seniors, veterans, foster and former foster youth, and justice system involved people disproportionately face homelessness. When people have no homes, they have to engage in basic human activities such as sleeping, resting, and eating outside or in public spaces. Most cities and states criminalize or penalize these activities by people experiencing homelessness, subjecting people to costly fines, unrealistic debt burdens, and often imprisonment. Penalizing people does absolutely nothing to end the crisis, and it causes severe harm, including sleep deprivation, stress, and frequent and often life-threatening interactions with law enforcement. A federal court recently found that criminalizing life-sustaining activities violates the Constitution's protections against cruel and unusual punishment. This crisis, I want to be very clear about this, this crisis is human created. It is caused by laws and practices that have consistently privileged the monetary value of land and property rather than investing in policies that primarily treat land and property as the place that individuals and communities must live together. So, the Housing is a Human Right Act arises out of that analysis. And I want to just highlight a few key aspects of the bill. First, the Act recognizes that homelessness tracks systemic inequality, and it requires targeted investment in communities experiencing systemic inequality. We have to recognize inequality if we are going to address it properly. Second, the Act invests $100 million a year in community-driven alternatives to penalization and criminalization of people experiencing homelessness. The bill authorizes grants to states, local governments, public defenders, and community organizations to support decriminalization and alternatives to penalization of homelessness. These funds can be spent on community-driven, harm reduction-focused law enforcement-assisted diversion programs, on improving municipal due process protection improvements for people's property, and on creating non-policing based supports for people who are experiencing homelessness who are in crisis. Third, the Act builds in far more space for direction and leadership from people who are or have experienced homelessness, recognizing that people who are directly affected are the experts and the people to whom service systems have to be held accountable. So the Act provides $5 million a year for 10 years in grants to nonprofits and local government to support programs and activities that will facilitate voting in elections. It also modifies the Federal Interagency Council on Homelessness, creating an advisory board of people who are or have experienced homelessness, as well as advocates. I'm very proud of this act. You know, I have a long history of working on human rights as a framework. In fact, back when we were talking about detention centers, we started the work by doing reports on the human rights of immigrants within detention centers, and nobody wanted to listen to us then, but now I think we're finally getting our message across. I talk about healthcare as a human right as the lead sponsor of the Medicare for All bill, and this is another opportunity for us to really think about what are those core rights that allow people to live with dignity and respect, that allow people to really access the full nature of who they are as human beings. And so that's what I think of when I say the phrase housing is a human right. And that's why I've introduced this bill together with 6 other bills by members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, which I'm a very proud co-chair of. And our People's Housing Platform consists of bills by Representatives Chuy Garcia from Illinois, Ocasio-Cortez from New York, Ayanna Pressley from Massachusetts, Ilhan Omar from Minnesota, Rashida Tlaib from Michigan, and Earl Blumenauer from Oregon. That legislation included Representative Ocasio-Cortez's bill, A Place to Prosper Act of 2019, which strengthens tenants' rights and ties highway funding to equitable development, as well as Representative Omar's Homes for All Act of 2019, which would improve and significantly expand public housing and affordable apartments built with the National Housing Trust Fund while preventing displacement. I am really looking forward to working with everyone on this call on the Housing as a Human Rights Act, as well as all of these other bills. And to just say that, you know, I think that these pandemics that we are facing, COVID-19, economic devastation with tens of millions of people who have lost jobs, combined with the awakening of this country to the legacy of anti-Blackness and white supremacy, of police brutality, and the reasons why law enforcement was set up to start with, which really were to capture enslaved people who were trying to get away to freedom, and then later to enforce Jim Crow laws. I think we just have to understand that there is a lot intertwined in this issue of homelessness, and we are going to have to pick apart those strands, and we are going to have to continue to think about our solutions as very multifaceted, that there really is a deep connection between healthcare and homelessness and all of these other issues. So thank you so much for having me on today. Again, sorry for the technical issues, and Anne, I know you're going to do a fabulous job of going on to the next steps and energizing people who are on this call to just continue your advocacy, continue your belief in what is possible, and continue your work to move the boundaries of what is seen as possible so it becomes clear once and for all that housing is a human right. Thanks so much to everybody.
Thank you, Representative, and you do the same. Keep it up.
All right, sounds good. Take care.
All right, that was fantastic and inspirational. We will get on to what we can do now. All right, so, and take us forward with what's coming up next.
Yeah, well, thank you for having her on. You know, I obviously have read the bill myself, and there are some just extraordinary things in that bill that I don't know that I ever thought that I would see in a proposal coming from a member of Congress. It actually choked me up a little bit just because it is amazing. So thank you for having her. She was awesome. Okay, so we talked a little bit about what's already been passed in the CARES Act. And now I want to talk a little bit about 2 pieces of legislation that are moving through the process that also will have a pretty big impact on people experiencing homelessness and housing instability. And the first is the HEROES Act. This has been passed on the House side and is under consideration by the Senate. So there is some work to do on the Senate side regarding this piece of legislation. And I will just quickly run through some of the most important aspects related to housing in particular in the HEROES Act. So first, it replaces the moratorium that we discussed a little while ago with a new 12-month moratorium on non-payment evictions. So there, it protects folks who are at risk of homelessness or at risk of eviction for a much longer period of time, which I think is incredibly important given the uncertainty of our economic future in this country. The next thing that I want to make sure that folks are really paying attention to is the emergency rental assistance portion of this bill, which is $100 billion. Like, I can't even imagine that I'm saying that out loud in the context of running it through an existing program like the Emergency Solutions Grants. It takes the aspects of the Emergency Solutions Grants programs that we need to have in place in order to really do solid emergency rental assistance, and sort of pulls them into this bill that is so critical, is going to be so critical to ensuring that we are protecting both people who are at risk of eviction due to our economic situation, but also because we need to protect landlords, and especially small landlords that provide naturally occurring affordable housing throughout this country. I worry about them, that their housing will end up getting bought up and no longer be available to the people that we need it to be available to. So that is $100 billion in emergency rental assistance. On top of that, we have another $11.5 billion in ESG funding that is specific to people experiencing homelessness. That is I know it probably looks like an odd number, but there's some method to this particular number. Dr. Dennis Culhane and his team posted a paper on what they thought the potential cost of addressing COVID-19 for people experiencing homelessness might be. And the total was about $15.5 billion. We have $4 billion on the street now, so this is the balance of the need for people experiencing homelessness. And then we have another $5 billion in the Community Development Block Grant Program. And maybe one of the most interesting and really important pieces to this act is the next bullet, which is $1 billion for the first year of funding to provide 100,000 new permanent housing vouchers targeted to people who are experiencing homelessness, at risk of homelessness, and who are survivors of domestic violence. So that will provide, while ESG can do short and medium term rental assistance, that will be the ability to provide long-term rental assistance. As in the CARES Act, there are a variety of other supports for tenant-based rental assistance and other public housing or housing choice voucher programs, as well as some of the other programs that I mentioned before, including the HOPWA program, the 202, 811, and housing counseling programs. And then the last thing I would just note here before we move to the next slide is that there is language that passed on the House side that actually cancels, for those of you who are in a continuum of care or who are part of a continuum of care application every year, it actually cancels the 2020 competition so that communities can really focus their energy where they need to focus it right now, which is on coronavirus relief. So just going to the next slide very quickly, the House has also released their 2021 homeless budget. And I'm not going to run through this in detail, but I want to identify a few things that I think are incredibly important. There is $250 million in this budget to address unsheltered homelessness within the United States. So that is something new that we have not seen before, and that is tied to what we are the situation we find ourselves in right now related to COVID-19 and people experiencing homelessness. There's also a $25 million eviction prevention bucket for legal assistance for low-income tenants who are facing eviction. And for the first time, there is a set aside, a HUD-VASH-like set aside, but at $250 million in new housing choice vouchers for people who are experiencing homelessness, specifically veterans who are not eligible for HUD-VASH and survivors of domestic violence. So it is by itself a really good budget to look at in terms of homeless assistance. But I think more importantly, when you look at it as a package, when you look at the CARES Act and the HEROES Act and this together, the possibilities in front of us are we have some opportunities in front of us to make sure that we have resources that we need on the ground. And then the last thing I want to note on the next slide is really that the federal government aren't the only ones that are working to help communities understand how to make really tough decisions and navigate their response. There are a number of national organizations that are working together to build this framework for an equitable COVID-19 homelessness response. There's a link to it there. You can find it on the National Alliance website. And there are also a number of resources coming out as part of that project that really can help communities ensure that they are doing things like not criminalizing homelessness and putting in place policies to combat the criminalization of homelessness, that we are using equity-based decision making, and that we are leaning into our responsibility for using a racial justice and equity approach as we use these funds going forward. So I think with that, I'll turn it back to you, Eric, and thank you for having me.
Thanks so much, Anne. Anne's contact information is up here, and there's a bunch of resources on the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities website that has a lot of the summaries of this legislation and additional commentary, so to help people push it along. Again, can't emphasize enough, the HEROES Act has passed through the House, but not the Senate, and there is very little time to get that done before people start losing their homes. So this is the time to be calling your senators. With that, actually, before we get to Kathy, and since I know you may have to go a little bit before the end of the show, why don't we do just one quick set of questions here. Somebody asked, how can we find out how the CARES Act funds are actually being used locally? So if you could just address that quickly.
Yep. So HUD has posted on their website the allocations. They did the allocation specifically for ESG and CDBG is what I'm specifically talking about right now. They did the allocations in a couple of different tranches. They have that information posted on and in order to agreement, communities had to adjust their consolidated plans. So hopefully most of them have posted it on their website. So that's where you can find it. Usually if your grantee would be your state, or it would be your city or county, and their amendments to their consolidated plan should be on their website, and that should tell you how they're using the money.
Yeah, just Google your state and amendment to consolidated plan COVID or something like that, and you should be able to find it. Yeah. And then a related question, is there any way of easily finding out how much grant money is coming into the community and where it's going? Is that kind of all within the consolidated plan?
Yeah, you'll find that, again, the allocations are on HUD's webpage, and I will put that in the chat for everybody to be able to link to. For communities that don't have a direct allocation, they have to go to their state's webpage in order to find how their funding that's coming through their state is being allocated across geographic areas within the state.
Great. So we'll keep you on as long as we can keep you on, but at least those questions we got answered. Great. So with that, now I will turn it over to Kathy Alderman, who is the Vice President of Communications and Public Policy at the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless. She is also a lawyer, comes from a legal background, but has been doing a lot of work across a wide number of nonprofit organizations and municipal government, et cetera, and has a really broad understanding of how the systems work together, and has been doing that for the past several years on behalf of people experiencing homelessness in Colorado. So I will turn over to her to talk about how this funding that Anne was just talking about from the CARES Act is actually being put to work in communities, and what's working and what isn't working.
Great. Hello, good afternoon. Thank you, Eric, for the introduction, and appreciated the overview of the funding. And I know Representative Jayapal had to get off the phone, but really appreciated her coverage of her bill, which I will mention for a second. But just kind of wanted to give a perspective of how these dollars and some of these programs are working on the ground. And Eric, if you don't mind going to the next slide, I'll start talking about, early on in this crisis, what we realized was that being homeless is absolutely incompatible with public health guidelines. We know that unhoused people can't do what their mayors and governors are telling them to do. They can't go home, they can't isolate at home, they can't stay at home. They have very little access to sanitation facilities. Social distancing is virtually impossible in congregate settings, and so providing 6 to 10 feet between individuals was very challenging for our service providers. And our shelter system was never meant to be a long-term solution to homelessness. And unfortunately, we relied on shelters for far too long to be places of respite and recovery for people experiencing homelessness. But they're absolutely incompatible with a public health crisis where people need space, where people need their own doors to close, they need access to hand sanitation and bathrooms, and they need not to be sharing air and other services with hundreds of other people. And so we really needed to think kind of broadly about how are we going to respond to this crisis on the ground. And you can go to the next slide. And the first thing that we needed to do was figure out how are we going to de-densify these congregate settings? How are we going to give people the space that they need? How are we going to get access to more screening and testing supplies? Even now, we're in an environment where there might be more tests available, but they're very slow to return, which is really difficult for a population that's not in the same place all the time. And then how do we remove high-risk individuals who, if they were to contract the virus, would be likely to need hospitalization or critical care? And then how can we give people a place to recover if they get the virus and they don't have a home, or they're not sick enough to go to the hospital? And so all of these strategies were things that we had to implement pretty quickly, and the funding for each of them looks a little bit different. And then we really needed to think about how do we use this crisis to look at some of those long-term solutions. We can't put 800 people in motels and hotels during the crisis and then tell them, crisis is over, go back to the street, go back to the shelter. That's not protective of their health. That's not protective of the community's health. And frankly, it's not the right thing to do. And so we really need to focus on how we use these funding opportunities for these long-term solutions. We know that people experiencing homelessness are at high risk of catching the virus and requiring hospitalization if they do. And then as we've learned more about this virus and the potential for asymptomatic carriers and asymptomatic transmission, that makes it even more difficult to contain the spread in these congregate settings. If people aren't showing symptoms, they're not seeking testing, how do we know if they're spreading the virus? There was the test out of Boston that showed 1 in 3 were carrying the virus but showing no symptoms. We had a pilot in Denver that demonstrated about 20% of our folks using congregate setting shelters were asymptomatic carriers. So taking that into account, we really needed to focus on these isolation, motel, hotel, and long-term housing options. Next slide, please. So we had a couple of opportunities in Colorado to get some money into the system. Obviously, the CARES Act fund was a huge win, but we're definitely going to need to do more. And there were different ways that the CARES Act funding could be allocated. And the first way is through the governor issuing executive orders, and then the second way was through some authority that our state legislature was given to allocate certain funds. So early on, our governor did issue an executive order for about $3 million to be used for rental assistance and mortgage assistance. And those were state funds. And then he later was able to use another executive order to allocate about $10 million for rental and mortgage assistance from CARES Act funds, from those earlier COVID relief dollars. Our state legislature then passed a bill to allocate funding for a variety of housing needs, focusing on populations of people experiencing homelessness who would be at high risk of contracting COVID. And those are people largely living in shelters and in encampments. And so those dollars are not yet completely flowing, but they will be used to really target alleviating the issue of homelessness and alleviating the issue of not having a home for people that are at high risk using shelters and living outside. Next slide, please. So the first stream of funding, or the first way that we fund emergency response, is by using FEMA public assistance dollars. And this is a pretty complicated way to get money into a system. So those dollars are in direct response to an emergency that must be declared and must be kind of requalified every 30 days. And that's how we're going to end up paying for these motels and hotels that we acquired for people to isolate, recover, and to reduce exposure to those high-risk populations. But those dollars are only going to cover 75% of the cost, which means that local governments have to come up with the additional 25%. Some of the CARES Act funding might be able to be used for that 25%, and some states and localities might have other emergency relief dollars that they can use. But I think it puts homelessness service providers in a bit of a predicament, because if they don't know where that 25% is going to come from and they don't have the money themselves to cover it, it can be very difficult for them to make the decision to acquire additional spaces, including motels and hotels. It's also, these dollars are also dependent, as I mentioned, on this disaster and emergency declaration, which you can only get approval for 30 days at a time, which is so indicative of how we've been dealing with the crisis of homelessness on the street in short bursts, in short waves, as if it resolves itself in just a month. And so, we continually are asking our state, have you gotten approval for the next month? Because we know that we're only going to be able to keep the motels, hotels, and auxiliary shelter spaces as long as those declarations are in place. And then the activities funded must be in direct response to the disaster or the emergency. So it can't be used with that thinking of how do we solve for homelessness long term. And it can't be used for people who aren't impacted by COVID-19. So you may have a victim of domestic violence who needs to get out of her domestic violence situation and into a short-term housing situation during the pandemic. But if it's not related specifically to COVID, then those FEMA dollars can't be used. And so again, I think I just put that out there as something that we need to think about in terms of how do we both respond to the crisis we have on the ground, as well as the long-term crisis of homelessness and risk of homelessness that we've been dealing with for years. And then the fourth issue with FEMA dollars is that it must be coordinated through a local emergency operations center. So either at a local government level or through the state level. And not all local emergency operations centers are making responding to homelessness a priority during this time, or see the need for acquiring motels or hotels or shelter spaces, because they've never really had to deal with the crisis of homelessness at this level. And so it kind of takes a little bit of needling to get a seat at the table and then also to make this issue a priority. Next slide, please. And then, as Anne talked about, the CARES Act funding has slowly started to come to states and get out into communities. I will say that the biggest holdup right now for CARES Act funding is that HUD has still not issued guidance on how the funding can be used. So while states may be putting out needs assessments or requests for funding opportunities to tell people what would you use the funds once you have them for, they can't really release them in a dedicated way until that guidance from HUD is coming out. This funding was passed months ago, has been sitting in the bank accounts of states for weeks, and HUD still hasn't given states the authority to use it. So that's entirely frustrating, especially for the people that it's impacting. However, we did in Colorado, we got 2 allocations of ESG funds to the total of about $32 million, which can be used for 24 months rental assistance, services, outreach, and shelter. We have applied to the state with needs assessments indicating how we would like to use those dollars. And we just learned that the first tranche of funding must go through the continuum of care organizations, which in some states there's only one continuum of care, in some states there's multiple continuum of care, and continuum of cares are not always the best way to get money flowing quickly, because then they also may have to go through a needs assessment process or a RFP type process. So we're advocating that the second tranche of fundings not have to necessarily go through COC. And I say that as an organization that is a COC for the balance of our state. So it's not just that I think, money needs to come directly to organizations like ours, because it is, but then we have to get it out to local communities, and it might be easier for local communities to be able to apply directly. We also received block CBDG funds in 2 tranches of about $15 million, and those uses can be for rental assistance as well. But rental assistance as a public service or in response to the public health crisis, and not necessarily as a long-term housing activity. And we're still awaiting HUD guidance on those dollars as well. And then I just wanted to mention that we did receive a small allotment of HOPWA funds for the one provider in Colorado that does provide that housing. Next slide, please. And then some entitlement communities received direct allotments of funding. And so in Denver, we received about $26 million total. And early-ish on, our mayor was able to allocate about $6.5 million of that for housing relief, and an additional $5 million for public health and safety needs, including testing, PPE, and increased sanitation supplies. But on the housing relief, there was 1.5 dedicated for rehousing strategies. We have just put our application in this past weekend to access those dollars, and they have to be spent by the end of the year. So the idea that we're going to be able to rehouse people living in motels and hotels or staying in shelter or coming directly from encampments through the end of the year, I don't think is unfathomable. But then what do we tell landlords at the end of the year? Do we tell them that they definitely will have a longer term lease with this individual? Do we tell the individual that they should be trying to figure out how they might pay their rent after a 6-month period of time? So again, there's some frustrations with the short-term focus of some of the federal dollars. And I think that's why we would advocate for additional federal investments that's taking a little bit more of the long view, not just to resolve homelessness because that's our goal and that's our mission, but to make sure that people experiencing homelessness are protected during this long-term public health crisis. The things I think that many of us take for granted right now. Next slide, please. So what do we need? Well, I think you heard the Congresswoman say and Ann say, we need the Senate to act on something. They have proposal after proposal in front of them. We know that there are disagreements about particular policies and strategies, but people are suffering. And it's not the time to say, well, let's wait and see if this eviction crisis happens. It's happening. We need to provide rental assistance to individuals today, and we need to plan for providing rental assistance for months to come, because this pandemic and this impact to our economy and the businesses that have had to shut down are not going to be resolved in, two months from now. So we are very supportive of the HEROES Act, the Public Health Emergency Shelter Act, that brings in more resources for shelter and for rental assistance. We also are very supportive of the suspension of the NOFA process for renewals. So as Anne mentioned, right now, continuum of care organizations are in the process of having to apply for funds to keep people housed that are currently housed. 93% of HUD's funding through this NOFA process to continuum of cares is just to keep people housed. Only 7% of the dollars are for new projects. So we're advocating that the renewal process be suspended this year. We leave people housed where they are. And for new projects, perhaps there is a truncated process that HUD could issue to get new populations housed. But it is insane to ask, especially nonprofit housing providers and homelessness providers, to go through this arduous process with HUD right now while we're trying to help manage the new crisis on hand. And then, as I've mentioned, we've got to focus on long-term housing options. We've got to get beyond just rapid rehousing and the expectation that people, a month and a half or a year from now are going to suddenly be able to afford a rent that they couldn't afford today, especially in this economic environment where we're seeing such high unemployment and we're losing so many jobs. The long-term needs, I think, we've really been talking about here. The Housing is a Human Right Act is certainly something we need to focus on and move towards from a long-term basis. We've got to focus on evictions, not the ones that are just happening now, but the ones that have been happening for decades, where renters have very few options and little protection, where we've prioritized the legal rights of landlords over renters for far too long. We need to invest in housing choice vouchers and project-based vouchers so that we can start getting some projects off the ground. We can't let our public housing infrastructure deteriorate at the rate that it's deteriorating. It is some of the only affordable housing in many communities. And then we've got to make some long-term investments in actual development through the Housing Trust Fund and low-income housing tax credits. And in Denver, the reason this is feeling so urgent to us right now is that 3,300 individuals that have been using the auxiliary shelters that we set up for dedensification purposes are unique, meaning that they're not people cycling in and out. These are individuals that might be using the system for the first time. That's a huge increase. Our auxiliary shelters are closing, meaning that in a week's time, 1,000 people are going to be without a place to go. And when our regular shelters do start to open back up, they're going to be at half capacity because of physical distancing requirements. So we don't even have the underfunded, under-resourced system that we had before this crisis after this crisis. We're seeing increased street camping, especially in the Denver area, that is really drawing the attention, of the media, of our elected officials, and I think, frankly, is a direct result of people not wanting to go into congregate settings because of the public health crisis, and because we're seeing people losing their homes because of this eviction crisis that is really just starting to roll out. And then we need to continually think about this public health impact on people experiencing homelessness. Again, you can't go home, stay home and isolate if you don't have one. And we need to make sure that everybody has a safe place to be, not just during a public health crisis, but for, forever. So I think looking at those long-term strategies is really going to be critical right now. And that's all I have about the Colorado response. Happy to talk through or answer any questions that folks might have. And I appreciate, again, the opportunity to speak with you today.
Thank you so much, Kathy. This really helps put what Anne was talking about into the local perspective and demonstrates, both why what is there is good and is needed, but could be done much better and much differently, and lessons learned for that, but also why there is so much more that's needed. So I think it was a perfect transition. And with that, I will then transition to this next section and to Francine Friedman and Christina Barone, who have been champions for us at Aiken and Gump, one of our pro bono law firms. Every time we have asked them to help us with a project, they have not only enthusiastically said yes, they have gone above and beyond and come up with creative suggestions that we hadn't even considered ourselves. And Francine, in fact, we were going to host our national conference at the offices of Aiken and Gump this year. Obviously, that can't happen with COVID, but that's the kind of level of assistance that they were willing to provide to the movement. And yeah, I can't say my gratitude enough for the work that Francine and Christina have been doing for us. And so right now, one of the projects we've asked them to do is with the new push for legislation to address the racial equity crisis in policing, help us to keep track of what's going on the Hill, and help us make sure that where we can insert provisions and get homelessness addressed as part of this larger movement to defund the police and invest into community solutions instead. So yeah, let's hear from Christina and Francine what is going on the Hill.
Thank you, Eric. It's an honor to be here today and a true privilege to work with you on all the projects we've worked on. So thank you for inviting me and Christina and trusting your important work with Aiken Gump. So in May and June of 2020, protests erupted nationwide after the publication of video footage of Minneapolis police officer pressing his knee into the neck of George Floyd, leading to his death. That incident and the nationwide protests in response has sparked heightened interest at the federal level to implement reforms of state and local law enforcement. On June 8th, House and Senate Democrats acted swiftly to introduce bicameral and comprehensive legislation to reform law enforcement across the country, including measures to reprogram existing funds to invest in transformative community-based policing programs. On June 16th, President Trump issued an executive order to address law enforcement misconduct in communities across the United States, noting that all law enforcement officers should undergo unique training and respond to mental health, homelessness, and addiction encounters. The next day, on June 17th, Senate Republicans introduced legislation with similar provisions to the proposed Democratic measures and the president's executive orders. Christina is going to walk us through the details of these proposals, but a key takeaway for homelessness advocates is that the Democrats' bill included housing status as a data point to be collected when there were incidents of police use of force. Additionally, calls to defund the police at all levels have included a suggestion that resources be redirected to social services, many of which will help homeless individuals. Now for the details, Christina is going to share highlights of the leading police reform proposals that we're seeing both in the Congress and from the administration. Take it away, Christina.
Thank you, Francine. So on June 8th, Congresswoman Karen Bass of California, who also serves as the chairwoman of the Congressional Black Caucus, along with Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey, led the introduction of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act of 2020. The bill seeks to reform policing while making it easier to hold officers accountable for misconduct in civil and criminal courts. Among other provisions, the bill would standardize the operation of police departments across the nation, provide additional training for law enforcement officials, and as Francine highlighted, reprogram existing funds to invest in community-based policing programs. Also, as Francine mentioned, the Justice and Policing Act mandates data collection on police encounters. For example, the bill requires state and local law enforcement agencies to report use of force data, including by race, gender, disability, religion, age, and specifically the housing status of each civilian against whom a law enforcement officer used force. On June 25th, the House passed the legislation. However, the Senate, which is controlled by Republicans, as we know, has taken a different approach. On June 17th, Senate Republicans, led by Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina, introduced the Justice Act. The Republicans' bill does not mandate changes to policing practices, but rather incentivizes police departments to institute changes by withholding federal funding from police departments who fail to end practices such as chokeholds and no-knock warrants. The bill also requires law enforcement agencies to report officer-involved deaths to the FBI and encourages the broader use of body cameras. The bill also calls for the creation of a commission that would be tasked with leading a comprehensive review of policing tactics and identifying best practices for officers. While the bill includes similar provisions to the proposal introduced by House and Senate Democrats, the Republican bill does not call for housing as a data point in the same way as the Justice and Policing Act. The Senate has failed to achieve the 60 votes required for the GOP bill to advance to the Senate floor. However, Senate Democrats have also said that the GOP bill was not salvageable, so they chose not to support efforts to debate or amend the legislation. Furthermore, as Francine discussed, in response to recent protests, President Trump signed an executive order calling for some reforms to policing on June 16th. The executive order calls for the creation of a national database of police misconduct, provides new guidelines for training and credential processes for police officers, and encourages departments to ban chokeholds in order to access federal funding. But importantly, the order acknowledges that it is the policy of the United States to promote the use of appropriate social services as the primary response to individuals who suffer from impaired mental health, homelessness, and addiction. It also recognizes that because law enforcement officers often encounter such individuals suffering from these conditions in the course of their duties, all officers should be properly trained for such encounters. To that end, the order calls on police departments to work alongside social workers and mental health professionals and for the creation of programs to help law enforcement better address mental illness, homelessness, and addiction. Now, although the executive order does not include any references to housing status, the Trump administration has laid down a helpful marker by recognizing that the creation of programs to help law enforcement better address issues like mental illness, homelessness, and addiction are necessary in the deployment of law enforcement. And finally, as the presumptive Democratic nominee, Vice President Joe Biden's campaign released a robust plan to address housing. His plan calls for the development of a national strategy to make housing a right for all and reforms to federal housing programs to ensure they take a housing first approach to ending homelessness. But also on June 8th, Vice President Joe Biden's presidential campaign released a set of policy recommendations reached by joint task forces with supporters of Senator Bernie Sanders, including the input of Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, who joined us today. The Biden Unity Task Force provides recommendations to protect communities by reforming the criminal justice system and expresses support for policies that would reorient the public safety approach toward prevention and shift away from over-policing, including by making evidence-based investments in jobs, housing, education, and the arts. The Biden Unity Task Force also provides recommendations to reinvigorate community policing approaches, allowing officers to better serve the neighborhoods they work in and make smart investments to incentivize departments to build effective partnerships with social workers and mental health and substance use counselors to help respond to frontline public health challenges. And lastly, the Biden Unity Task Force also recommends requiring data collection by federal law enforcement agencies on all core police activities, including police shootings and deaths in custody, use of force, and stops, searches, and arrests. The Unity Task Force also recommends this data be broken down by race, ethnicity, gender, disability, and other demographic characteristics and made publicly available. It is important to note that Biden is committed to housing, but his plan does not identify housing status as a data point. We would want to target our advocacy efforts to make sure he knows to recognize housing as a data point in the context of police reform. And now I'm going to kick it back to Francine to discuss the outlook and key takeaways from each of these proposals.
Thank you, Christina. U.S. lawmakers are reportedly attempting to revive the legislative efforts Christina covered on police reform in the House and the Senate. However, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell indicated that he would not consider the House-passed Justice and Policing Act, and Senate Democrats blocked Senator Scott's Justice Act, which has support from the Trump administration. Both bills are considered to be top contenders to become law if and when the House and the Senate can come together. The baseline bill, however, will likely be determined by the results of the November election. If the Senate is taken back by the Democrats, the House-passed bill will have a much clearer path for passage. The current legislative standoff reflects the hyper-partisanship in Congress, and the looming election will make it more challenging to enact reform measures this year. The key points of contention are eliminating qualified immunity, Section 1983, protections for police, which is deemed a non-starter by the White House, and allowing victims of misconduct to sue police for financial damages. Republicans argue that this would negatively impact law enforcement, but Senator Scott has indicated that he would be willing to consider allowing victims to sue municipalities, counties, and states instead. There's a long road ahead on the federal legislative front, but we have some hope and helpful takeaways when it comes to homelessness and social justice. We've learned from programs like Cahoots, crisis assistance helping out on the streets, a mobile intervention program in Oregon that responds to a broad range of non-criminal crises, including homelessness, disorientation, intoxication, and substance abuse, that approaching situations stemming from behavioral health or poverty challenges with mental health crisis workers instead of or in conjunction with police leads to a better outcome and less risk of escalation or serious harm. Support for alternative models of policing as passed in the Justice and Policing Act lead to a broader discussion and the ultimate adoption of such models, including things like cahoots at the state and local level. State and local officials often take their cues from congressional proposals, and it's therefore important to advocate that any state or local changes or data collection consider cahoots-like approaches and collect data on housing status, so they can tackle any systemic challenges related to how their local homeless population is treated with regard to police force. By including and recognizing housing status in the data to be collected, the Democrats have demonstrated recognition that homelessness is often a factor in the use of police force. Even if federal law were never to change, the federally backed proposal is an important reference model for state and local governments seeking to adopt alternative approaches to policing. Additionally, the June 16th Trump executive order also indicates support for the use of social services rather than police response when addressing mental health, homelessness, and addiction. Finally, as Christina mentioned, if elected, a Biden administration may be prepared to act in a transformed political environment, abiding by an approved set of policy priorities to address housing in the context of criminal justice reform. While the Biden platform does not include housing status as a specific data point in its police reform proposal, the Vice President has a demonstrated commitment to housing, and there is an opportunity to advocate a similar approach to what the congressional Democrats have supported. There are many indicators and reasons for hope that going forward, policymakers will recognize housing as a human right and enact policy to reflect this important position.
Eric, I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Thank you. Thank you so much for your presentation, and it's a really useful summary and a really useful guide to what some of the next steps for advocacy might be. So with that, we'll transition into some Q&A, but first, I did want to ask folks if what we've shared today has been useful. Will you use what you've learned today in your advocacy on behalf of people experiencing homelessness during COVID-19 and beyond? We'll leave this up for a second. While we're doing this, I will say again that the webinar is being recorded, and if all goes well on the technical side, should be available in the next day or so. You'll get a follow-up email from us with the link to that, so you can share it with others, view it again yourself, and we'll have a link to the slides as well as other supporting materials in that email. But with that, I'm glad to say that there we go. We got 99% of people saying yes, that this is good. I don't know who the contrarians are, but it's great to hear that this has been a useful webinar, and there we go. And then this is more as part of our continuing advocacy for the human right to housing. Is the framework of housing as a human right something that you find useful and will be talking about in your future advocacy? We'll leave that up there for a minute or so, 10 more seconds. All right, and close that. And again, it looks like this is a popular approach, and it's very gratifying after that long history of having it being seen as too much or outside of the the realm of possibility that now this is a mainstream approach, and it's something that everybody's talking about because it needs to be talked about in this way. I'll also quickly mention that we have more in the series every other week of the webinars coming out, and some of the topics are there. You'll get a link to the registration for the next one in the follow-up email as well. Last but not least, before we hit the Q&A, I'll just say that the crisis is forcing us to see and truly understand how interconnected we all are. Without housing, sanitation, and services, our neighbors, primarily our Black and brown neighbors, are on the front lines of a deadly pandemic. And unless we continue our work towards lasting solutions, they will continue to be on the front line day in and day out. But the crisis has also shown us that there are effective and inexpensive ways to provide housing as a human right. So now we must ensure that we don't go back to the status quo that existed prior to the pandemic, but that we actually are doing better and moving beyond that status quo as we go forward. And I hope that you might consider supporting the Law Center's work towards both those immediate and those long-term permanent solutions. And you can do so at the link there. With that, I will come back to some of the questions that have come in. And one of the questions is probably for Kathy. Is there any focus on housing navigation for those on shelter wait lists or in diversion? I assume this is with regard to how the CARES Act funds are being distributed.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and we hope so, we believe so, but again, we're still waiting on HUD guidance to tell us exactly how we can and cannot use the funds. But we have put applications in both to the city of Denver and the state of Colorado that has included housing navigation as a critical resource for people to get connected with potential landlords, transitional housing options, and to use these rental assistance dollars in a way that bridges to a potential long-term resource. And so while we can't do much about the current wait lists that exist for housing facilities, I think we can use the skills of housing navigators to help us build new relationships with landlords and some of these motels and hotels that might be sitting empty for months. Maybe this could really be a great landing place or a shorter term option for people while they, to help get them stable and keep them protected from the virus spread, but also let them get their paperwork in order, figure out, what their next employment opportunity may or may not be, figure out what benefits they're eligible for, and then using those short-term rental options or rental assistance dollars to kind of hold them over until we can find a long-term option that might go beyond the crisis response money.
Great. So not exactly related, but another person asked, is there any relief or reimbursement available to private individuals or organizations who have paid or are paying for hotel rooms for people experiencing homelessness?
So FEMA public assistance dollars should be available for people that have done that, but they have to be in coordination with a local or state emergency operations center. So I would encourage anybody who has been engaged in that work to figure out who your local emergency manager is for your county or your municipality, and whether or not they still have an emergency operations center up and running. If they do, then they should have applied for the types of services that could be reimbursable as part of crisis response. If you don't have that connection at the local level, county or municipality, then you can go to your state emergency operations center. That's likely going to come out of an emergency management office within your state that already exists. Some of them are being led by public health entities, but you should be able to connect to find out if they So in Colorado, our state got essentially a blanket approval for non-congregate shelter facilities. So the use of motel and hotels for people that were experiencing homelessness and needed a place to either prevent spread because they're high risk or to recover from a positive test result.
Great. That's super useful. Someone else commented that it's very important for people to see that this movement is occurring, and asked if we have a list of positive, healthy legislative actions that have been passed and implemented since George Floyd's death. I think Christina and Francine, the answer is at the federal level, nothing has passed yet. Is that right?
Well, yes, nothing has passed and become law. On the House side, they've passed the Democratic proposal, but that has gone and sat in the Senate side. And on the Senate side, they have not yet passed Senator Scott's proposal because they don't have enough votes to get that through on that side. So nothing has passed and become law. There is the executive order, which has some useful language with regard to police training, but no laws have been passed yet at the federal level. And as I said earlier, I'm not sure that there will be much action ever, but at least it lays the groundwork and sends the signals to where the real activity happens, which is at the state and local level.
And I'll add that the Law Center has been tracking responses to the COVID pandemic with regards to homelessness from the federal down to the local levels, just through newspaper reports. So as comprehensive as we can make it with Google searches, but certainly not a full list. But we have more than 500 entries in a spreadsheet that you can find on our website at nlchp.org/coronavirus. And there's just a whole list of how communities have been responding with some through constructive things like putting a ban on evictions of homeless encampments during the duration of the crisis, and then others who are actually getting people into housing, into hotels, and doing other constructive things like that. So there's a bunch of examples that we've pulled out on that website, and then a full kind of spreadsheet of everything. So that is there as well. But that's more focused specifically on the coronavirus response as opposed to just the policing response since the murder of George Floyd. All right, and I think the other questions. There's a question about somebody who's been helping a family stay in a hotel for 5 months, but they haven't been able to get a rental unit due to their credit history. Is there any help that potentially could be coming for them?
I'm getting a notification that my connection might be bad. So can you still hear me? Okay. So I think the question was about somebody having a difficult time being eligible for rent because of credit history, and whether there are funding resources that might be able to help with that.
Yeah.
There are a lot of waivers that have been approved for how people can use housing vouchers and can stay housed. I don't know if there's one specifically about getting around credit approval, but it would be worth finding out what waivers your state applied for people who are potentially on waiting lists or awaiting approval for a housing voucher, to see if any of those waivers might make it easier or reduce some of the barriers that we know keep people from getting into housing. But I can't speak specifically to any kind of broad allowance, for getting around potential credit reviews for rental units.
Appreciated. All right, and then that's the last of the questions I've seen in the question box. If anybody has any final ones, you can ask again. in the question box, but the last one I see is more of a suggestion about is there a way to have a town hall about this campaign in the person's county, and that this education is desperately needed. And the answer to that is there could be a way if you can figure out how to organize it locally. Luckily, we are in a moment where the virtual town halls are becoming more and more common, and so we can beam ourselves in there. We can gather some of our friends and allies, like the folks on the call right now, and try to beam them in as well. So yeah, it's up to all of us really to see what we can do and what we can provide from the national level. We are happy to help do as much as we can to bring that down to the local level to help you make the change that needs to be made in your community. So reach out to us at the Law Center, and we will see what we can do. But with that, I will thank our panelists who are still on the line here, and if anybody has any additional questions, we will certainly be able to try to transmit them and get follow-up answers for you. But please tune in again in 2 weeks for our next webinar, and we will see you then.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you.